America often presents itself as the world's symbol of freedom, equality, and opportunity. But Malcolm X challenged that image with a question that still echoes today. What does freedom really mean if an entire people are treated as second-class citizens? He argued that when rights are limited, voices are ignored, and communities are systematically held back, the label of citizenship becomes little more than a mask. Behind it, he said, lies a modern form of control that looks different from the past but functions in much the same way. Malcolm X did not speak to provoke fear or division. He spoke to awaken awareness. His message was direct. If a system promises equality but delivers exclusion, then the problem is not patience, it is power. He warned that symbolic progress without real change can be more dangerous than open injustice, because it convinces people to wait instead of act, to hope instead of understand. This story is not just about history. It is about how narratives are shaped, how language is used to soften harsh realities, and how people can be persuaded to accept less than they deserve. Malcolm X asked Black Americans to look beyond slogans and ceremonies and examine their everyday lived experience politically, economically, and mentally. Who controls the decisions? Who benefits from the system? And who is asked to keep waiting? As you listen, keep one thing in mind. This message is not about anger. It is about clarity. It is about recognizing patterns, reclaiming dignity, and understanding that real change begins when people see the truth for themselves. If content like this helps you think deeper and see history from a sharper perspective, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. These stories matter, and understanding them is the first step toward understanding the world we live in today. As Malcolm X continued to peel back the layers of the American story, he moved beyond the illusion of freedom and turned directly toward one of the most effective tools ever used to weaken oppressed people: division. After exposing how second-class citizenship functioned as a modern form of control, he addressed a deeper reality that many were reluctant to confront. The suffering experienced by Black Americans was not selective. It did not ask about faith, political affiliation, or personal ideology before striking. Whether one prayed in a church or a mosque, marched peacefully or spoke boldly, the outcome remained the same. The system responded not to belief, but to identity. Malcolm made this point with striking clarity. He observed that violence, discrimination, and exclusion were never justified by whether someone was Christian or Muslim, moderate or radical. The reason was always the same. Black people were targeted not for what they believed, but for who they were. This understanding reshaped the entire conversation. If the pressure came from one source, then infighting only served the interests of that source. Arguing over labels while enduring the same conditions meant missing the larger truth that unity was not optional, but necessary. This is where Malcolm's message grew more powerful and more dangerous to the status quo. He refused to let religion become a battlefield. Faith, he explained, was personal. It guided morals and private life, but it should not be allowed to fracture a collective struggle. History had already shown what happened when belief systems were placed above shared reality. Debates multiplied, energy was wasted, and progress stalled. Meanwhile, the system responsible for the harm continued untouched, benefiting from confusion and division. By reframing the struggle in this way, Malcolm forced his audience to confront a difficult question. If the system did not differentiate between a Black Christian and a Black Muslim, why should Black people allow those differences to separate them? The refusal to answer that question honestly, he warned, would ensure that the cycle continued. Unity was not about erasing identity or belief. It was about recognizing a common condition and responding to it with collective awareness. Malcolm's storytelling did not rely on theory alone. He pointed to everyday life. Employment discrimination did not pause to ask about theology. Housing segregation did not shift based on ideology. Political neglect did not soften for those who followed the rules or sang the right songs. The same obstacles appeared in different forms, but they led to the same destination: restricted opportunity and controlled outcomes. Understanding this pattern was the first step toward breaking it. What made this argument especially compelling was its honesty. Malcolm did not promise comfort or approval. He offered clarity. He challenged the audience to examine how often they had been encouraged to argue among themselves while the structure above them remained unchanged. He exposed how unity had been replaced with labels, and how those labels became tools of distraction. When people are busy defining themselves against one another, they are less likely to question who is benefiting from their separation. This perspective transformed the struggle from a moral debate into a strategic one. It was no longer about proving who was right in belief or method, but about identifying what worked. Malcolm emphasized that real progress required focus, discipline, and a shared direction. Without these, even the most passionate movements could be redirected, softened, or absorbed by the very system they sought to challenge. By linking shared oppression to shared responsibility, Malcolm X created a narrative that demanded maturity rather than emotion. He urged Black Americans to see themselves not as fragmented groups competing for recognition, but as a people facing a single, deeply rooted structure of inequality. Only by understanding that reality, he argued, could they begin to dismantle it. In this way, unity became not a slogan, but a strategy, and awareness became the foundation upon which real change could finally be built. After dismantling the illusions of second-class citizenship and exposing the damage caused by internal division, Malcolm X moved the conversation toward a harder, more demanding conclusion. Awareness alone, he argued, was not enough. Understanding oppression without changing who holds power only leads to frustration. This is where he introduced Black nationalism, not as a slogan or an emotional reaction, but as a practical framework for survival and progress. At its core, he defined it as self-determination, the simple but radical idea that a people cannot be free if they do not control the forces shaping their lives. Malcolm explained that dependence was the quiet partner of inequality. When decisions about Black communities were made by those who did not live there, suffer there, or grow there, the outcomes were predictable. Promises were made without accountability, policies were designed without understanding, and leadership was selected for comfort rather than commitment. He argued that true power could not be borrowed or gifted. It had to be built from within, rooted in shared experience, and protected by collective responsibility. This vision reframed politics entirely. Voting, Malcolm suggested, was meaningless if it only served to legitimize leaders who were unresponsive once elected. Representation without control was merely another layer of distance between people and the decisions affecting them. He challenged his audience to question whether political participation was being used as a tool for change or as a ritual that maintained the status quo. Self-determination meant more than being counted. It meant being heard, respected, and capable of enforcing consequences when leadership failed. Economics played an equally central role in his thinking. Malcolm pointed out that communities without economic control remain vulnerable, no matter how many speeches are delivered on their behalf. When money flows outward and dependency flows inward, autonomy disappears. Jobs vanish, schools decline, and neighborhoods are left negotiating for basic resources. He argued that economic independence was not about isolation, but about stability. Ownership created leverage, and leverage created options. Without it, communities were forced to accept terms set by others. Leadership, in Malcolm's view, completed this triangle of control. He warned against elevating figures who spoke well but answered to outside interests. Leadership, he insisted, must emerge from the people it represents and remain accountable to them. Otherwise, it becomes symbolic, offering reassurance without protection. This was not a rejection of allies, but a rejection of surrendering authority. Malcolm believed cooperation was possible only when it was built on equality rather than dependency. What made this message unsettling was its clarity. It left little room for excuses. If progress was slow, Malcolm suggested, it was often because responsibility had been outsourced. Waiting for institutions to correct themselves ignored the reality that systems rarely dismantle the very structures that empower them. Self-determination required patience, discipline, and sacrifice, but it also offered something rare, agency. By tying Black nationalism to everyday realities rather than abstract ideology, Malcolm transformed it into a call for ownership rather than separation. He spoke of communities shaping their own futures, setting their own priorities, and protecting their own interests. In doing so, he challenged the audience to imagine freedom not as permission granted by others, but as a condition created through collective action. This idea connected seamlessly to everything he had already exposed. A system that treated black people as second-class citizens would not suddenly deliver first-class outcomes. A society that benefited from division would not encourage unity. In Malcolm's vision, self-determination was the answer to both. It replaced dependency with responsibility and confusion with direction. By insisting on control over politics, economics, and leadership, he offered not just a critique of the present, but a blueprint for a future shaped by those who had long been denied the right to shape anything at all. Having laid the foundation of self-determination, Malcolm X turned to the everyday mechanics of control that quietly shape a community's fate. Money. He understood that political language could inspire, and leadership could mobilize, but economics decided whether progress could survive. Without economic awareness, he warned, even the strongest movements would circle endlessly, demanding change while unknowingly feeding the very structures that kept them powerless. Malcolm described a pattern so familiar that many no longer questioned it. Black communities worked, earned, and spent, yet the benefits of that labor rarely stayed where it was produced. Money flowed outward at the end of each day, leaving behind neighborhoods stripped of investment, opportunity, and stability. Stores were owned by outsiders, housing was controlled by distant interests, and employment decisions were made far from the people most affected by them. Over time, this imbalance transformed vibrant communities into neglected spaces, not by accident, but by design. What made this system particularly damaging was its subtlety. No force was required. No laws explicitly ordered communities to drain themselves of resources. Instead, habits were shaped, expectations lowered, and dependency normalized. Malcolm argued that when people are taught to believe they cannot build or sustain their own institutions, they become trapped in a cycle where consumption replaces creation. The result is visible everywhere: deteriorating infrastructure, couple-minded, limited services, and a constant struggle to address problems that never seem to disappear. He challenged the idea that these conditions were natural or inevitable. Ghettos, he explained, were not created by the people who lived in them, but by economic arrangements that removed value faster than it could be replaced. When wealth leaves a community repeatedly, decline is not a failure of character, but a predictable outcome. Complaints about poor housing or lack of opportunity, while valid, missed the deeper issue if they ignored where the money went and who controlled it. Malcolm's critique was not rooted in blame, but in accountability. He asked his audience to look honestly at how economic choices, made individually and collectively, shaped the future. Every dollar spent was a vote, a decision about which communities would grow stronger and which would be left behind. When those choices consistently favored outsiders, the consequences were unavoidable. Dependence grew, bargaining power disappeared, and the ability to define one's own priorities eroded. This insight connected directly to his broader argument about self-determination. Political control without economic strength, he suggested, was fragile. Leaders could be elected, speeches could be delivered, but without financial independence, real leverage remained out of reach. Economic dependency ensured that even well-intentioned reforms could be reversed or ignored. Those who controlled resources ultimately controlled outcomes. Malcolm contrasted this reality with how other communities protected their interests. He observed that groups who valued their own survival invested in themselves first, building businesses, social institutions, and networks that reinforced one another. This was not about exclusion, but about self-respect. Communities that circulated wealth internally created jobs, stabilized families, and funded education. Over time, these investments compounded, turning small beginnings into lasting influence. What made Malcolm's message resonate was its practicality. He was not offering abstract theory or distant promises. He was describing cause and effect. Spend without control, and decline follows. Build and reinvest, and stability grows. This clarity stripped away excuses and forced a re-evaluation of long-standing habits. Economic empowerment. Dependency, he argued, was not a luxury reserved for the future. It was a necessity for survival in the present. By exposing economic dependency as a cornerstone of inequality, Malcolm X deepened his challenge to the system. Awareness, unity, and leadership all mattered, but without control over economic life, they remained vulnerable. His message was ultimately about reclaiming agency, recognizing that dignity is sustained not only by protest or policy, but by the ability to support one's own community. In that understanding, economic independence became more than a goal. It became a form of resistance, quiet but powerful, capable of reshaping neighborhoods from the inside out. After confronting economic dependency and revealing how money quietly determines the health of entire communities, Malcolm X turned his attention to another powerful mechanism of control: party politics. By this point in his argument, the pattern was clear. Political promises, like economic incentives, often appeared generous on the surface while delivering very little beneath. Malcolm warned that without a deeper understanding of how political systems operate, black voters risked becoming a resource to be managed rather than a force to be respected. He described American party politics as a carefully staged performance, one that repeated every election cycle with striking consistency. Campaign seasons brought renewed attention, warm language, and carefully chosen symbols meant to signal inclusion. Candidates spoke of progress and equality, appealing to hope while avoiding commitments that carried real consequences. Once elections ended, however, urgency faded. Issues that had dominated speeches were quietly postponed, redirected, or reduced to symbolic gestures. Malcolm argued that this pattern was not accidental, but structural. What made the system especially effective was its ability to present false choices. By framing politics as a strict division between two opposing parties, voters were encouraged to see loyalty as a duty rather than a strategy. Malcolm challenged this framing directly. He questioned how genuine freedom could emerge from a system in which both sides benefited from maintaining the same underlying order. If outcomes remained unchanged regardless of which party held power, then participation alone could not be mistaken for influence. Malcolm's critique was sharp but calculated. He did not deny the importance of political engagement. Instead, he exposed how engagement without leverage became exploitation. Black voters were courted as a decisive bloc, their numbers praised and their support assumed. Yet policy victories that addressed systemic inequality rarely followed. This imbalance, he argued, revealed the truth of the relationship. Support was expected, but accountability was optional. He often used storytelling to make this point resonate. A politician could speak eloquently about justice while quietly supporting policies that reinforced inequality. A party could claim progress while tolerating conditions that contradicted its public image. Over time, these contradictions accumulated, creating a gap between rhetoric and reality that many had learned to accept as normal. Malcolm insisted that acceptance was the most dangerous outcome of all. This argument tied directly into his broader vision of self-determination. If political parties could rely on automatic support, they had little incentive to deliver meaningful change. Real power, Malcolm suggested, came from independence, the ability to negotiate, withhold support, and demand results transformed voters from participants into stakeholders. Without that independence, politics became a one-sided transaction. Malcolm also warned against emotional attachment to party identity. When loyalty replaces critical thinking, it becomes easy to excuse failure and overlook broken promises. He encouraged Black Americans to evaluate political action by results rather than language. Were living conditions improving? Were rights being protected consistently? Were opportunities expanding in measurable ways? If not, then slogans and speeches were irrelevant. By exposing the deceptive comfort of party politics, Malcolm aimed to break a cycle of disappointment. He believed that clarity could restore agency. When people recognize how systems benefit from their silence or predictability, they can begin to disrupt those systems. This did not require withdrawal from politics, but a redefinition of engagement. Participation had to be conditional, strategic, and rooted in collective interest. In connecting party politics to economic dependency and divided leadership, Malcolm revealed a single, entire, interconnected structure: promises without power, representation without control, and participation without results all served the same function. They maintained stability for those at the top, while offering reassurance to those at the bottom. His message was not cynical, but realistic. So, freedom, he argued, could not be won through loyalty alone. It required independence, awareness, and the willingness to challenge systems that thrived on expectation rather than delivery. As Malcolm X reached the final movement of his message, everything he had exposed began to converge into one unmistakable conclusion. Awareness without unity would collapse into argument. Economic understanding without political maturity would be neutralized. Participation without leverage would remain symbolic. For Malcolm, true liberation demanded a transformation not only in conditions, but in consciousness. Black people, he argued, had to see themselves not as isolated communities pleading for fairness, but as a people with collective power capable of shaping their own destiny. Unity was the foundation of this vision. Malcolm was clear that unity did not require uniformity. Differences in religion, background, and personal belief could exist without weakening the struggle. What mattered was shared purpose. As long as divisions were allowed to dominate the conversation, the system remained secure. But once unity replaced fragmentation, the balance of power began to shift. Unity turned numbers into influence and frustration into strategy. Political maturity was the next step. Malcolm defined maturity as the ability to think beyond emotion, beyond loyalty, and beyond fear. It meant understanding how systems work, recognizing when promises were empty, and refusing to give support without accountability. Political maturity transformed voting from a habit into a tool. It meant knowing when to participate, when to negotiate, and when to apply pressure. Without this maturity, even the right intentions could be manipulated. This understanding led Malcolm to one of his most forward-thinking conclusions: the need to move the struggle beyond civil rights and into the realm of human rights. Civil rights, he explained, confined the fight within the borders of a system that had created the injustice in the first place. Courts, laws, and institutions could delay, dilute, or deny justice while maintaining the appearance of progress. Human rights, on the other hand, elevated the issue to the global stage, where hypocrisy could no longer hide behind national narratives. By framing the black struggle as a human rights issue, Malcolm connected it to liberation movements around the world. He reminded his audience that people in Africa, Asia, and other colonized regions had not waited for approval from their oppressors. They exposed injustice internationally and forced accountability through global pressure. This shift was not about rejecting the country, but about refusing to limit the fight to arenas that offered no real remedy. Malcolm's conclusion was not a call for chaos, but for clarity. He believed that systems only change when the cost of maintaining injustice becomes too high. Unity raised that cost. Political maturity applied that pressure strategically, and a global perspective removed the shelter of denial. Together, these elements formed a path toward dignity and self-determination. As this story comes to a close, it leaves us with questions that still matter today. What does freedom look like when it is real? Who controls the structures that shape our lives? And what happens when people decide they will no longer wait to be recognized as human? Thank you for listening and engaging with this story. If this message challenged the way you see history, power, and freedom, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay connected. More stories like this are coming, and each one brings us closer to understanding the truths that still shape our world.